Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk to you about my recent book. And I owe thanks to so many of you for your hard work behind the scenes to make this event happen. Peggy, Jenny, Suzette, Patrick, and really all of you at the Olin Library, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end, but let's get started with the lecture today. So in my lecture today, I'd like to talk about how ancient Jews and rabbis who lived 1,500 years ago practiced medicine as recorded in a work of rabbinic literature, the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud was produced orally in late antiquity from the 3rd to the 6th or 7th century CE by generations of rabbis who researched Bible within study academies located along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Babylonia, or modern-day Iraq, which at that time was under the rule of the Persian Sasanian Empire. Now, let me be clear from the start that medicine is not the first topic that one typically expects to learn about in a lecture on the Talmud. Instead, the Talmud is most famous for its complex debates between rabbis on all matters of law, ranging from the rules of the Sabbath and Jewish festivals, to marriage and divorce, to civil and criminal cases and beyond. Composed in Hebrew and Aramaic, the Talmudic corpus is a vast 2,700-page collection of mostly legal traditions that to this day represent the basis of normative Jewish law and behavior. Thus, given its status as a canon of Jewish law, the question of what the Talmud has to do with medicine may seem somewhat odd. Recently, however, scholars have increasingly come to recognize that the Babylonian Talmud is an anthology of overlapping genres, including laws, stories, rituals, folklore, magic, and of course, also medicine. So in my talk today, I'll focus on this last genre of Talmudic text, one which experts have often neglected to study, namely healing therapies for specific ailments, or what I'll call Talmudic medicine. Many Babylonian rabbis of late antiquity were experts in the medical sciences of their time. Indeed, the Talmud is by far the richest source of therapies in ancient Judaism before the rise of Islam. Although it routinely mentions ailments in the context of law, it also has a rich set of sources that discuss illnesses and remedies on their own terms. Most famously in a medical handbook called the Book of Remedies, found in Tractate Gittin 68b to 70b. And here in this image, you can see a fragment of this work from the Cairo Geniza. The Gittin Book of Remedies is a lengthy work of approximately 1,000 words, comprised of over 40 remedies to treat more than 20 different afflictions. It was likely an independent written or oral composition from the 3rd or 4th century that editors inserted into the tractate that deals with divorce deeds. These types of independent sources are not uncommon in the Talmud, with other examples being a folkloric cycle about pious men, and a dream book. As I explain in more detail in my book, there are a few reasons why the Talmud contains this medical handbook, including its presumed value for promoting the health of the Jewish community at large. Now, in addition to the Book of Remedies, the Talmud has two other compilations of therapies in Avodah Zarah 27a to 29a and Shabbat 108b to 111b, as well as shorter traditions found elsewhere. Although they do exhibit some differences with one another, all of these sources are related in terms of style and content. They mention the same ailments, share a set of unique motifs and literary forms, and prescribe similar therapies. Their features and content are idiosyncratic relative to expected Talmudic discourse, a result of them presumably stemming from their emergence alongside methods of trial and error and observations of nature and the body. Now, as you can see here, the Talmud refers to over 70 different ailments, some of which you see listed here on the left. Many are commonplace problems, such as toothaches and headaches, while others are more serious conditions, like pleurisy and liver or lung malfunction. Despite restrictions against human autopsy, the Talmud is familiar with the diseases of the internal organs, including the kidneys, spleen, heart, and intestines. The rabbis gained some of this knowledge from inspecting ritually slaughtered animals. The rabbis were also aware of the dangers that the natural world poses to one's health, from the perils of scorpion stings and thorn piercings to the risks of consuming spoiled food, And they also had a nuanced understanding of the deleterious effects of climate and the environment on one's health. Now, to heal physical ailments, the Talmud recommends a wide range of options, from the more magical methods such as spells and amulets, which I won't be able to discuss with you today, to the more empirical approaches that rely on the use of natural drugs. In my book, I tend to focus more on the empirical therapies, in part because they've been less researched than the magical medical tradition. Many afflictions are remedied through potions or mixtures of these materia medica, some of which you see here listed on the right side of the slide, that a sick person eats, drinks, or applies to an affected area, such as smearing salves of acacia and aloe to treat hemorrhoids, bathing in boiled plants to cure strangury, or staunching a bloody nose by inserting tampons with medicine on them. The empirical background to these techniques is notable. In an article on observation in rabbinic literature, the Talmudist Richard Kalman shows that a process of trial and error, along with the recording of failures, fueled the production of these types of therapies. Supporting this argument, there are at least a dozen remedies which warn against potential hazards, implying that the accurate execution of the remedies was essential. So here's one example of these warnings and a remedy for cataracts from the Gittin Book of Remedies, and it reads as follows. For cataracts, bring a scorpion with 7 joints, dry it in the shade, pound it in a mortar into 2 portions of coal and 1 portion of scorpion, and paint the eye with 3 paint sticks on this eye and 3 paint sticks on that eye. But do not paint with more, because if one does not follow these instructions, the eye may burst. In this therapy, the Talmud is obviously cautioning against putting too much ground up scorpion on a cataract patient's eye, which can cause it damage. Now, with these therapies, one can see how the Talmud endorses human treatments over divine intervention. In other words, faced with the dilemma of whether to treat one's health to God or to human physicians and natural drugs, Babylonian Jews were in favor of the latter. By contrast, the Hebrew Bible portrays God as the one and only healer in a theological light, though, to be clear, there were physicians in the ancient Near East and in biblical Israel. In general, then, the Talmudic therapies are relatively unique within the ancient Jewish literary tradition, as the Bible and Second Temple sources contain few comparable therapies in detail and scope. The rabbis expressed their preference for human healing in an interpretation of Exodus chapter 21, verses 18 to 19, a legal case from the Bible, which you can see here on the left. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with stone or fist, and he does not die but has to take to bed, if he then gets up and walks outdoors upon his staff, the assailant shall go unpunished, except that he must pay for his idleness and his cure. This biblical law deals with an instance when 2 men get into a fight and the assailant is held liable for recompensating the victim's lost wages and medical expenses by a physician. In the Talmud, the rabbis cite Exodus 21:19 as a proof text to argue that God, in fact, authorized human beings to heal. That is to say, they focus on the implication of the words, he must pay for his cure, which they take to mean medical expenses. This rabbinic interpretation appears in the context of a discussion about a prayer that one should say before visiting a bloodletter. And here is the text on the right from Berachot 60a in the Talmud. It reads, when one goes to let blood, one should say, may it be your will, O Lord my God, that this deed will be a remedy for me, and you shall heal me, for you are God, the trustworthy healer, and your remedy is true, because it is not the position of people to heal, but they've become accustomed to this. The Babylonian rabbi Abaye said, a person should not say thus, for the academy of Rabbi Ishmael taught in a baraita in earlier tradition, and his cure from Exodus 21:19. And from this verse, we learn that authority was given to the physician to heal. So at the beginning of the text, the prayer for bloodletting praises God as the true healer and criticizes human healing. But in response to this, the 4th century Babylonian rabbi Abaye rejects the need to say this prayer and instead cites Rabbi Ishmael's interpretation of Exodus 21, which teaches that God gave the physician authority to heal. Abaye is thus expressing a preference for human medicine over a reliance on the belief that God is the only true healer. And this proclivity among the Babylonian rabbis is corroborated, of course, by the Talmud's inclusion of the dozens of therapies. This drift away from God and toward human healing caught the attention of later medieval Jewish authorities who felt the need to account for it. The 13th century Spanish scholar Nachmanides, for instance, argued that this shift was due to the fact that the ancient Israelites had lived during the prophetic period, whereas the rabbis lived after God's presence had waned. Historians today can attribute this rupture to a variety of factors, including the circulation of medical knowledge in Sasanian Persia, to which the rabbis were privy. And I'll return to this topic later in my talk. Throughout the Talmud, the rabbis engage in all sorts of medical activities. They transmit, analyze, debate, and perform remedies. They identify, prepare, and consume drugs. And they speculate about etiologies and the demonic invasions of the body. The rabbis involved in these activities come from a range of time periods and locales. There are a few dozen rabbis, from the earliest Tanaim in Palestine to the latest generations of Babylonian Amoraim, who are important figures in the medical tradition. Many are authoritative rabbis in Babylonia, such as Rav and Shmuel from the 1st generation, or Abaye and Rava from the 4th. Notably, each of these 4 sages served a different community. The therapies thus appear to have circulated widely and were not a specialty of any one city or academy. That said, some rabbis did have specific areas of expertise. For instance, Rav, who lived in the first half of the 3rd century CE, offered advice about bloodletting diet and heart problems, and was aware of the magical aspects of health and illness, such as the evil eye. In Pesachim 113a, Rav cautions his own son against consuming drugs and having his teeth removed, suggesting that such advice was passed on from father to son. Moreover, the rabbis of subsequent generations also valued Rav's proficiency in medicine, and a lot of his traditions are recorded in his name by later sages, including by his disciple Rav Huna, who's another important voice in the medical tradition. In Shabbat 82a, for instance, Rav Huna chastises his son Rabba for ignoring the advice of Rav Chisda regarding how to avoid straining one's rectum when defecating, which Rabba dismisses as merely, quote, profane subjects. Rav Huna was also known for making medicine available to the community, as seen here in a passage from Ta'anit 20b, which says, when Rav Huna had something that healed, he would fill a water jug with it and hang it from the doorpost of his home, saying, anyone who needs may take some. This tradition epitomizes how the rabbis were motivated to learn and practice medicine to help others in the community. Perhaps the most famous rabbi in the medical tradition is Shmuel, who lived in the same generation as Rav. Some scholars believe that he was learned in both Greek and Babylonian medicine because he's said to have migrated from Palestine to Babylonia and may have studied in the medical schools of Nisibis. A contemporary of the Greek physician Galen, Shmuel also relates therapeutic traditions in other works of rabbinic literature from Roman Palestine, such as where he says that a child with the fever must wait 30 days before being circumcised. Like Rav, Shmuel was interested in both bloodletting and magic, though his knowledge of medicine was far more extensive than that of his contemporary. In Bava Metzia 113b, as you can see here on this PowerPoint slide, Shmuel boasts, I know the remedy for all things except 3 things, including eating unripe bitter dates on an empty stomach. He also used his expertise to help others and was perhaps most renowned for his eye salves. In one tale in the Talmud, Shmuel wants to treat Rabbi Yehuda, the patriarch's eye sickness, but when Rabbi refuses, he cleverly puts the medicine under the sage's pillow so that it gets absorbed into his eyes while he sleeps. Shmuel the astronomer was Rabbi's physician. Rabbi was sick in his eye. Shmuel said to him, I'll paint medicine on your eye. Rabbi said, I cannot. Shmuel said, I will indeed smear it on you. He said to him, I cannot. So Shmuel put a tube of medicine under his pillow, and he was healed. So in this text, you see Shmuel acts as Rabbi's physician, and he does so successfully. Now, this is, to be clear, a rare example of a case where a rabbi carries the title of physician, though the description of rabbis healing other rabbis does appear in other sources. Now, although, as I've been suggesting, the rabbis play a central role in the transmission and practice of therapies, it's equally important to point out that the core literary form of the Talmudic therapy genre is, in fact, often anonymous, meaning that they contain no attributions to rabbis. For example, the first 6 therapies in the Gittin Book of Remedies do not refer to the rabbis at all. These anonymous therapies usually follow the same formulaic structure, with a basic script that begins with the name of the ailment, followed by a list of ingredients and instructions on how to prepare and apply them. The first step of naming the ailment is a familiar technique in traditional medicine based on a need for classification. That is, one cannot heal what one cannot identify. After the introductory formula, the therapy gives instructions on which medicinal ingredients are needed and how to concoct and administer them. To prepare the drugs in the Talmud, one boils, cooks, burns, roasts, soaks, or grinds them. And to apply them, one drinks, eats, or rubs them, among other actions. So let's now look at the first remedy in the Gittin Book of Remedies for blood from the head, as an example of this formula, which you can see here on the right. And it reads, for blood from the head, bring cypress, tamarisk, myrtle, poplar, olive, bluestem, and cynodon. Boil them together and pour 300 cups on this side of the head and 300 cups on that side of the head. If not, bring a white rose whose leaves stand in a row, boil it and pour 60 cups on this side of the head and 60 cups on that side of the head. So as you can see, this anonymous remedy follows the basic script that I just described, right? For, bring, prepare, apply, if not. It provides instructions on how to heal someone who has a mysterious condition called blood of the head. Not really sure what this means. Whether this is a symptom or an affliction is unclear. But to cure it, the Talmud says one should boil shrubs and grasses and then pour 300 cups of the mixture on each side of the head. Alternatively, one can boil a type of white rose and pour 60 cups on each side. In contrast to some of the more specific posological details found in other remedies, these quantities of 300 or 60 cups were not meant literally, but rather to probably just imply large quantities. Now, as we just saw from this remedy for blood from the head, many therapies include alternative options introduced by the phrase, if not. And in what follows, I'd like to propose 4 interpretations of this phrase. First, the phrase, if not, reflects the Talmud's goal of encompassing all known therapies. As the scholar Giuseppe Veltri explains, this desire for comprehensiveness reflects, quote, not only the traditional exegetical premise of rabbinic hermeneutics to discuss everything at length, but also the method of the ancient empirical sciences, unquote. In terms of transmission, it is likely that some if not therapies were later supplements added under an initial rubric for a specific disease, perhaps in an organized medical manual. A second interpretation of the phrase, if not, is that the inclusion of therapeutic options is a latent acknowledgement that a given therapy might not be effective. In other words, to quote Veltri again, the Talmud views a magical recipe, a remedy, or a plant as a possible cure. The implication of this, then, is that a sick person should try the different remedies available until one of them hopefully works. Now, a third reason for including secondary options is in case a person is unable to acquire the necessary ingredients for a given therapy. Bavli Shabbat 110b's remedy for jaundice suggests that these were actual considerations. and it reads, and this is just a small excerpt of a longer therapy. Bring the head of a salted scale fish, boil it in beer, and drink it. If not, bring brine of locusts. If there is no brine of locusts, bring clear brine. And take him to a bathhouse and rub it on him. And if there's no bathhouse, place him between an oven and a wall. This therapy makes it clear that the alternative options are given in the event that brine of locusts and a bathhouse are unavailable. In some of the if not therapies, the secondary options are in fact easier to accomplish than the earlier ones. Hence, in this therapy, if one cannot find locust brine, then one can use clear brine. Or if one cannot access a bathhouse, then one can stand near an oven to achieve a similar effect. If we believe that the order in which the Talmud presents alternative therapies was purposeful, then these additions were perhaps meant to increase access. Another example of this trend toward simplification and access is seen in the two cures that Gittin 67b recommends to treat an ongoing heat stroke. For an ongoing heat stroke, bring a black hen, cut it open crosswise, shave the middle of the sick person's head, place the hen on it, and leave it until it sticks or putrefies. Then the sick person should go down and stand in the water up to the neck until becoming very ill and submerge, come up and sit down. If not, the sick person should eat leeks, go down and stand in the water up to the neck until becoming very ill and submerge, come up and sit down. So as you can see, the main difference between these two therapies is what the patient does before becoming submerged in water up to the neck. In the first cure, the patient has a dead hen placed on their head, surely an unpleasant experience, especially if it's let there until it rots, which is what the best manuscript tradition, Manuscript Vatican 130, says. And this is in contrast to the second option, where one simply needs to eat leeks, which are used in other Talmudic therapies. So the second therapy is, in other words, a more comfortable and realistic option. So coming back to if not, finally, the fourth reason that the phrase if not gets used is in order to provide different methods of treatment for the same ailment. For instance, in this text, in Shabbat 110b, one lengthy excerpt for jaundice reads, and bear with me while I read the whole thing. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Someone who wants to heat a person with jaundice should wrap him in his sheet." Rav Acha bar Yosef was ill with jaundice. Rav Kahana did this for him, and he was healed. If not, bring 3 measures equal to 1/10 grieve of Persian dates, 3 measures equal to 1/10 grieve of bitumen from honeycomb, 3 measures of 1/10 grieve of worm-colored alkali, boil them in beer and drink. If not, bring a donkeyful, shave the middle of its head, let blood from the donkey's forehead, and put it on the sick person's head. But be careful of the eyes, lest the blood blind him. If not, bring the head of a buck, boil it in beer and drink. If not, bring a hunchback pig, tear it open, and put it on the sick person's heart. If not, bring or eat leeks of garden beds. This text begins with Rav Kahana curing Rav Acha bar Yosef of jaundice by wrapping him up in a sheet, as Rabbi Yochanan advises. The text list of therapies connected by a series of if-not phrases shows the diverse techniques that the Talmud endorses towards a single illness, jaundice. The 5 options here, as you can see on the left, are drinking a potion of dates, bitumen, and alkali, pouring donkey blood on the sick person's head, drinking a potion with boiled buck's head, placing a pig on the sick person's heart, or eating leeks. So as you see, options 1 and 3 are liquid concoctions that the sick person drinks, while the 5th is eating leeks, a common food. The 2nd and 4th options involve animals, either pouring donkey blood on the head of the afflicted or a magical transference ritual using a pig. So in sum, each alternative therapy uses a different method of treatment. So as we've seen, these anonymous therapies often recommend potions made up of natural ingredients to treat an illness. Here's another example of this from the Gittin Book of Remedies, in a therapy for an illness, usually identified as either pleurisy or catarrh. And it reads, for pleurisy or catarrh, bring sal ammoniac about the size of a pistachio nut, honeyed galbanum about the size of a nut, a spoonful of white wine, a natla measure of machosin clear brine. Boil them together, and when the sal ammoniac boils, then the entire potion is cooked. If not, bring 1/4 of a log of white goat milk and let it drip on 3 stalks of cabbage and stir it with a stem of marjoram. And when the stem of marjoram is cooked, then the entire potion is cooked. This therapy gives detailed instructions for how to prepare 2 elixirs to treat the affliction, including how to know when they're fully cooked. In the first option, one boils together very specific amounts of 4 natural ingredients, namely sal ammoniac, a mineral made up of ammonium chloride, which is water-soluble and still in use today as an expectorant. Galbanum, a plant with resin derived from its stems, which also today is still used in the same way. Third, white honey. And fourth, brine from Machosa, a city in Jewish Babylonia. Now, it's worth noting that this therapy displays no obvious rabbinic or Jewish elements or symbolism. This is generally true in the anonymous therapies. Although the Gittin Book of Remedies mentions the Sabbath, some Hebrew names, the Jewish calendar, the Mishnah, and Elijah, these types of references are limited and often made in passing. Conspicuously missing from the therapies are invocations of God, the patriarchs or Moses, or a reliance on earlier Jewish texts as the basis of materia medica or the procedures, or borrowings from ritual or mythic symbols from their ancestors. As the head of the Pumbedita Academy in the 10th century, Rav Sharira Gaon understood, the Talmud's medical therapies are not commandments, nor are they rooted in any obligation to Torah or to God. In sum, as I argue in the book, the therapies are not patent expressions of Jewish religious identity, nor do they have any obvious didactic message or legal principles behind them. This was one reason that the Talmudic therapies were not performed by medieval Jews in the centuries after the redaction of the Talmud. When the rise of Greco-Arabic medicine, circa the 9th to 10th century and beyond, also precipitated a rupture in scientific paradigms that made medieval Jews view the earlier Talmudic therapies as incommensurable with the scientific knowledge of their time. A skeptical attitude toward Talmudic medicine is on record by the 10th century, when the heads of the Babylonian rabbinic academies expressed doubt about its efficacy. This claim that the Talmud's medicine was ineffective forced the authors to explain away its negative implication that the authoritative rabbis were in error and their traditions unreliable. These later commentators justified their position in various ways, such as by arguing that they were unable to correctly identify the ancient plants in the Talmud, thereby making it impossible for them to actually practice them. Others argued that the biological makeup of human beings in the natural world had evolved through the centuries such that the older therapies had now become irrelevant. Rav Sharira Gaon sums up these attitudes toward the rabbinic remedies in this way. Our sages were not physicians. They only recommend that which their experience had proved helpful. And their advice in these fields is by no means law. We must therefore not rely on medicines mentioned in the Talmud. Only he may use them who has them examined and confirmed by experienced physicians, and who has the assurance that at least they can do no harm. For Sharira Gaon, Talmudic medicine's efficacy was therefore neither trustworthy nor legally binding. And this skeptical attitude was pervasive among other medieval and early modern Jewish groups as well, including the Tosafists, the Talmudic commentators, who were well-versed in the Talmudic therapies, as well as the Karaites who rejected the authority of oral Torah altogether. So throughout the Middle Ages and up until today, there exists a tension between, on the one hand, the Talmudic canon as an authoritative curriculum of law, and on the other hand, its ineffective and voluntary medical customs. And in my book, I cite a telling anecdote that illustrates how debates over the value or lack thereof of the medical passages in the Talmud continue even until today. For example, a 2010 blog post by an Orthodox yeshiva student explains in reference to a Talmudic therapy for an infected pustule that, quote, passages like this are seldom taken seriously, insofar as even many stringent Orthodox pay them no heed. I recall that during my time studying at an Orthodox yeshiva in Israel, I heard two of the brightest students engaged in heated debate over whether or not to just skip the medical parts. One argued in favor of skipping them because the passages were didactically useless. One argued for studying them anyway, despite their being didactically useless. So these types of debates are a result of the complicated status of the therapies within the Talmudic tradition as archaic and thus ineffective medical advice that are non-obligatory customs with little in them that are explicitly Jewish or even rabbinic in ideology or identification. At the same time, it's important to emphasize that from a historical perspective, these features of the Talmud's therapies are not unique to the Talmud, since the separation of scientific medicine from religion is likewise attested in the extant medical writings of other communities in the Sasanian Empire. As I discussed in the last chapter of my book, the Talmudic therapies were influenced by the medical knowledge circulating among non-Jewish Aramaic-speaking communities. Medicine is, in fact, one of the richest data sets for researching the impact of the Sasanian context on rabbinic culture, a comparative approach that I've been applying in my research on the Talmud for the past decade, including in my 2015 book, seen here on the left, where I focus specifically on Persian influences on the Talmud in a variety of ways. My contextual research highlights the points of contact between the rabbis and the other religious groups around them, including Zoroastrians, Christians, pagans, Mandaeans, and Manichaeans. I do this by comparing the Talmud to the outside sources produced by these other groups. So, in short, my second book on medicine is a natural sequel to my 2015 book to the extent that it expands the lens of comparison beyond the Persian realm to include these other religious communities around a single theme or epistemology, medicine, for which there were indeed high levels of exchange and contact. Now, with respect to the study of Talmudic medicine in context, it's essential to highlight the research of Mark Geller, who's been the trailblazer in the field for decades. Through comparisons between Talmudic and cuneiform sources, one of which you see here, Geller's publication convincingly unravels the deep impact of the indigenous Akkadian magical medical tradition on the Gittin Book of Remedies and other Talmudic medical passages. As Geller demonstrates, this centuries-long cuneiform tradition, which ceases just before the rabbis come on the scene in Babylonia in the 3rd century CE, gets appropriated by the rabbis and other Aramaic-speaking communities as part of their scientific heritage. And here you see some of the publications of Geller. Now, in late antiquity, these cuneiform traditions eventually become amalgamated with other contemporary medical knowledge in the Sasanian world. And in my book, I offer a roadmap for understanding the ways in which the rabbis were participating in this common medical culture among these Aramaic-speaking communities, including Syriac Christians, Mandaeans, and the scribes who produced the Aramaic magic bowls. I argue that the rabbis legitimated, integrated, and regulated the therapies circulating in the Sasanian Empire, effectively rabbinizing them as a way to enhance their authority and reputation within Jewish society, and to also harmonize foreign customs with rabbinic culture and law. So let me give you one example of the type of comparative work that I do by showing you some of the similarities in literary structure and content between the Talmud's anonymous genre that I talked about, vis-a-vis those in a work called the Syriac Book of Medicines, which is here on the right in yellow. Now, the Syriac Book of Medicines is a vast work and a catalog of 600 therapies, the majority of which are based on, or translations of, the 2nd century Greek physician Galen. Its exhaustiveness is not surprising, given that the Christian communities played a formative role in the dissemination of medical thought in the Sasanian Empire by translating the writings of Galen and Dioscorides into the Aramaic dialect of Syriac, as well as in Middle Persian, a translation movement that laid the foundations for the later renaissance of Greek medical science in Arabic in the Islamic period. Now, the first 2 sections of the Syriac Book of Medicines are part of this translation movement. But I found little evidence of the Syriac Book of, I found little evidence that the Greco-Syriac medical tradition penetrated the Babylonian Talmud. But where we do see similarities between the Syriac Book of Medicines and Talmudic medicine is in the former work's 3rd section, entitled the Book of Topical Medicine. So this is a discrete work. And it's believed that the 3rd section contains Babylonian-influenced remedies rather than Greek ones, and that it dates, we think, to the Sasanian period, meaning that it appears to come from the same general time and place as the Babylonian Talmud. So to illustrate its similarities with the Talmudic therapy genre, let's read one remedy from this 3rd section of the Syriac Book of Remedies here on the right. For an ulcer and for scabs on the head, frankincense, dust, bread crusts, crush them up together, mix with olive oil, and smear it on the ulcer and the scabs. Or smear a person's blood on the scabs. Or crush camphor leaves in vinegar. Be careful lest this mixture harm the patient. Or pound the root of pyrethrum. So like the Talmud, this remedy from the Syriac Book of Medicines begins by identifying the ailment with the preposition for, followed by the ingredients and instructions for their preparation and application, and then ends with alternative options introduced by the conjunction or. Although the Syriac Book of Medicines and the Talmudic therapies have cognate terms, the 2 corpora do not recommend the exact same treatments or the exact same drugs for the exact same ailments. What they do share in common are some literary forms, phrases, drugs, terms, and technologies. In other words, the Syriac Book of Medicines and the Talmud are probably not directly borrowing from one another, but are rather part of the same common stock of knowledge that circulated among Aramaic-speaking communities in corpora, including in Mandaic sources, as seen in Mandaic sources and the magic bowls. Now, the rabbis themselves, despite their general reticence to acknowledge external influences, do on multiple occasions make it clear that they learned medical therapies from non-Jews. For instance, in the following story, in Avodah Zarah 28a, we read the following about Abaya's interaction with an Arab. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said, "Yeast water, olive oil, and salt. But Mar bar Rav Ashi said, fat of the goose in or maybe applied with the goose feather." Abaya said, "I did all these things, but I wasn't cured until a certain Arab said to me, bring olive pits that have not grown a third and roast them on a new spade and stick them on the teeth. I did this and I was cured." So here, Abaya says that after he tried 2 of his fellow colleagues' remedies for the tooth ailment scurvy, neither of which worked, he learned an effective therapy from an Arab, a nomadic merchant whom the Talmud invokes as a stock figure representing an outsider with esoteric knowledge of the human body and nature. Now, this is an extraordinary text because it shows Abaya favoring trial and error over the opinion of other rabbis and then doing a remedy that he learns from a non-Jew. But this leniency toward outside therapies was not without its problems. In several texts, the rabbis openly grapple with how to harmonize foreign therapies with their own legal traditions. And so to conclude my talk, let's read this longer therapy for blood coming from the mouth, And before I read it, I just want to point out that I broke the text up into 3 sections. And you'll notice that sections 1 and 3 are anonymous, as we've been talking about, while section 2 is actually a rabbinic dialogue that cites the Mishnah in a rabbinic legal compendium from 3rd century Roman Palestine. So here's the entire text. Bear with me as I read the whole thing. For blood coming from the mouth, the afflicted should be tested with a wheat straw. If the blood sticks to it, it's coming from the lungs, and there's a remedy for it. And if it doesn't stick, it's coming from the liver, and there's no remedy for it. Rav Ami said to Rav Ashi, but surely we've learned the opposite in the Mishnah, which says, these are accounted trefa. And trefa is an animal with an illness or defect that makes it unfit for consumption among cattle. Or if the liver is gone and not soever of it remains, or if the lung is pierced or defective. This is again from Mishnah Chulin 3:1. Rav Ashi said to him, when it comes from the mouth, say that the liver is completely disintegrated. The master said, if it comes from the lung, there's a remedy. What is its remedy? Bring 7 fistfuls of chopped mango wurzel, 7 fistfuls of chopped leeks, 5 fistfuls of pomegranate seeds, 3 fistfuls of lentils, a fistful of cumin, a fistful of spices, and a corresponding amount of unleavened bread, and cook it and eat it and drink strong beer of good quality. The recipe in section 3 of this text is an example of the blurred line between food and medicine in antiquity, which we've seen time and again. Its detailed posology regarding the number of fistfuls, a term found only in reference to materia medica in the Talmud, suggests an empirical background to the recipe, as does the use of a wheat straw as a diagnostic tool in section 1. As Mark Geller's research suggests, aspects of this therapy are borrowed from Akkadian medicine. Now, in section 2 of this text, this dialogue between Rav Ami and Rav Ashi is actually the first appearance of a rabbi in the Gittin Book of Remedies after a folio page of anonymity. The 2 rabbis are here debating the validity of the anonymous diagnostic test in section 1 vis-a-vis their own legal traditions that they know from the Mishnah, an earlier rabbinic work. In other words, the rabbis pit the conclusion of the anonymous diagnostic test against the tradition from the Mishnah, which lists the physical defects in cattle that make them unfit for consumption. That the rabbis mention animals in this way is not unusual, since, as I mentioned earlier, one of their main sources of knowledge about human diseases was through animal inspection. In holding this dialogue, the rabbis are essentially confronting the problem of how to harmonize the anonymous diagnostic test with their pre-established ritual mastery of animal defects. Tellingly, the rabbis succeed in synchronizing these different traditions, at least to the extent that they conclude that if the blood comes from the lungs, then there's a remedy for it, which, lo and behold, the Talmud, of course, appends to the end of the passage. So these are my concluding remarks. In conclusion, my recent book is an attempt to recuperate one of the more neglected subgenres of Talmudic literature, namely the empirical medical therapies, and to analyze them through both literary and historical lenses. When this is done, the totality of the evidence supports the conclusion that the Talmudic therapies were part of a larger system of medicine circulating in late antiquity, which the rabbis appropriate and make their own. As I discussed in this lecture, the evidence for this includes the research of Mark Geller on the Akkadian heritage of the Talmudic therapies, along with similarities between the Talmud and other medical texts of its time, like the Syriac Book of Medicines, as well as the therapy's idiosyncrasies as a genre in the Talmud, their anonymity, and lack of normative Jewish elements and status within the Jewish tradition since the Talmud was edited. To the extent that ancient rabbinic medical practices were based on the observation of nature, the senses, and trial and error experimentation, they can perhaps be thought of as secular science embedded within a corpus of canonical law. Indeed, this is the reason why ancient medical knowledge is often transmitted across religious, imperial, and linguistic boundaries. The desire for good health makes it less likely that people, including the ancient rabbis, will reject ideas and practices that may in fact work simply because they come from outsiders. So thank you very much.